Hello again, and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our First Corinthians study, and this being lesson number 9, and it covers chapter 5. Recall before we read this chapter that Paul has spent the previous 4 chapters addressing community conflict issues relative to the church. And he continues that in chapter 5. So as I open here, don't get so caught up in the sexual morality issue of this issue. This is still a continuation of what he was doing in the first 4 chapters. He's now just using a specific example. It's the best I can glean from the better scholarship, I think. And he continues in this particular case with a sexual morality example. And although morality of this community is probably something that is a big issue because of the nature of the community, if we'll recall from our opening introductory lecture when we talked about the nature of these people, setting the scope. They're a very diverse cultural, ethnically group surrounded this sea community, if you will, where the portage sea trade comes through. So the people from all diverse societies, plus the diversity of Greek and Roman society relative to its sexual mores anyway. So this would have been a major issue. So let's read what Paul has to say here. And again, remember that our focus will be to try to understand not what it means for us today, but what is Paul telling us, or what is this case, what is Paul telling the Corinthians? Chapter 5. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not found even among the pagans. For a man is living with his father's wife, and you are arrogant. Should you not rather have mourned, so that he who has done this would have been removed from among you? For though absent in body, I am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already produced judgment in the name of the Lord Jesus on this man, who has done such a thing. When you are assembled, and my spirit is present with the power of the Lord Jesus, you are to hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Your boasting is not a good thing. Do you not know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Clean out the old yeast, so that you may be a new batch, as you really are unleavened. For our Paschal Lamb, Christ, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the festival, not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and evil, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexual immoral persons, not at all meaning the immoral of this world, or the greedy and robber or idolater, since you would then need go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brothers or sisters, who is sexually immoral or greedy, or is an idolater, a rivaler, a drunkard, or a robber. Do not even eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging those outside? Is it not those who are inside that are to be judged? God will judge those outside. Drive out the wicked person from among you. Well, in some ways, what Paul is saying here is pretty obvious relative to what to do about it, but I want to spend most of my time with where I can glean what the scholars are telling us relative to the bigger picture here. Bible scholars are all over the place with this chapter, and it's difficult to find consensus in this argument. But there is, in the more modern scholarship especially, there is, I think, generally some good consensus. Some want to focus on the particulars of the morality issue, that is, the sin, and the church has somewhat, especially in more modern times, historically done a lot of that. Others mainly, though, focus on the church at Corinth and its lack of a response here. And so Paul makes a recommendation of how to handle it. Some of the more modern scholars focus on this as being a continuation of the first 4 chapters using an example, and I tend to think that is where Paul is going here. That is, that variations in morality are an issue in this community, and therefore, as he mentioned in a previous letter, he has warned them about this, and therefore has expected them. Why would he have warned them? Because we have to understand that the core belief system that Paul has introduced to these people in this church is from the Old Testament, the Judeo-ethic, if you will, not the morality ethics of the Greeks and Romans. So therefore, he perceived there probably would have been a conflict, and he's warned them to follow that old ethic. Most likely. We don't know, because that letter is missing. In this case, the divisive issues, the variation of morality in this Corinthian community is dividing because some people picked up the message, or maybe there are people, and likely so, probably some Jews in this community as well. So anyway, it's causing problems. In this case, the divisive issue focused on the particular brother's behavior. When he mentions brothers, understand what he means. He means members of the congregation. He is not, and makes it very clear if you follow his lead, he is not talking about judging the outside community. He's talking about what you do, who is within your congregation, who is within the Corinthian congregation, and how to take care of that. Sexual morality in general would have most likely been a significant issue for them because of the Corinthian people of the first century had a wide range and diverse range of sexual mores. Scholars all over the place tell us that. And therefore this issue that Paul brings up of you're doing something that even the pagans don't do, is that a lot of people take issue with that because that doesn't make sense with the circumstances. Yes, there would have been some pagan communities where what is going on here is well outside norm, but not necessarily here in this community. One scholar says Paul has picked one example to focus on here on how you take care of this. And what in particular is troubling Paul is that many of them have not recognized their brother's morality as a problem relative to the value system that the new religion requires. Get that point? That's where the scholars focus on. The new religion, the new paradigm that Paul has introduced to them, okay, which is based on Old Testament. He has introduced that. This is a different concept for them, and therefore they need to be adopting to it. It is that lack of recognition and corrective action relative to it that Paul is addressing here, several scholars point out. Paul is defining the Corinthian community by what it is doing relative to general Old Testament mores and what it's not doing, based on his value system rooted in the Judeo-ethic, which he's ultimately, basically, for lack of a better term, the so-called term Judeo-Christian ethic. In other words, he's trying to get that ethic to become the Christian ethic as well. Several scholars take issue, especially with this statement in verse 1, I believe it is, of the kind that does not even exist among the pagans. Because clearly, the particular issue that he brings up here Most likely this is the father's, and we don't know, but most scholars say this is probably a situation in which this man's father's dead. But we don't know that. But the point of it is, there is tremendous diversity in their society. There isn't any doubt that what is going on, it would be in violation of the mores of the Old Testament. So that's the point here. And Paul then makes it very clear. We're not trying to judge society. We're trying to establish a set of values within our church community. They argue that some pagans, yes, would have been offended by this action, but not necessarily here in Corinthians. They point out that both Roman and Greek cultures had a wide range of acceptances of sexual relationship among family members. So part of the conflict here is their values, Corinthian values, their value system versus the Judeo-ethic, which Paul is trying to move into the Judeo-Christian ethic, which would have been the value system that Jesus lived under. Paul expects them to have adopted fully that Judeo-ethic by this time. He makes a point not to use that ethic to judge society outside the church. It is to be used to judge those within the church. Then he puts his judgment to this particular case and makes it clear he finds it unacceptable, if for lack of a better word, sinful, and thus recommends expelling this brother publicly from the church, both for his benefit and the church's benefit. Paul essentially tells them, you should be ashamed of your church community over this action, what you've not done. That is, allowing him to remain in there. And so he's expecting adoption of the new value system. Instead, you are arrogant, puffed up, bragging about who you are, and you are not even handling the most basic of adopting yourself to the Judeo ethic. It's the way one scholar puts it. And therefore, this glaring violation of Old Testament guidelines is what he's after here. He then goes into an analogy, metaphor, use whatever term you want, relative to this diversion, using the Jewish Israelite Passover and the church's Eucharist to help them understand. And you might note, he uses this high holy day of Judaism as if they are very familiar with it. He doesn't go into details of explaining that holy day of Passover. He's assuming they understand it. Are they practicing it? There are some scholars who argue, they've continued to practice this for a while. But anyway, he makes the assumption they understand. He assumes they are fully familiar with this Jewish tradition, and that if they're not, in fact, observing it. His analogy is to equate yeast with sin. And the pre-Passover ritual, which was very big, in this extensive cleansing of your household and of the temple, to make before Passover, to make absolutely sure every speck of yeast was gone to the extent they could with the technology they had. I mean, this was a major event, and therefore he's saying you need to do the same thing, and relative to your church, that you do not allow sin to be practiced within the church. That sinful man. So this is hard to accept, but it's what Paul is pointing to here. Every speck was to be found and removed, would be the analogy. And why? Because sin puffs up. Sin causes arrogance. Yeast puffs up. So he's obviously playing this word game this word picture, this mental picture very nicely here. He is making the connection here that your Paschal lamb, your Passover lamb, is Jesus, the Christ. A perfect lamb without sin was sacrificed to them. You are to attempt to become a similar lamb. As your church needs to meet that standard before you take the Passover meal, that is the Eucharist. That's the meal he's referring to. That's the eating he's referring to. In other words, you don't even eat with these, and he's referring, scholars say, not to general eating a meal, it's referring to the Christian meal, the Eucharist. You should do the same by removing the yeast, that is the sin, before your church, before you take this meal, purifying the church of leavening, that is of sin. Paul points out some other sins too that scholars often say were more likely bigger issues in this particular community because of the socio-economic nature of it, where it was located at, and the kinds of businesses it was associated with. He could have listed a lot of other different sins. He's mainly focusing, they say, on the kinds of things that were a bigger issue there. Note, Paul refers to an earlier letter he wrote them. That letter has been lost in history. Boy, do we wish we had it. But we don't. So scholars have attempted to reconstruct it based on some references they find in various things, and so they surmise that Paul pointed out that they would have had problems with this area of sexual immorality as a bigger area because of the nature of what their traditional culture had been and what was still going on. And so he's reminding them they need to clean this up. Otherwise, they would continue to live by the pagan standards, pagan religious standards of their own culture. And as we've said, Paul has preached a paradigm shift. You need to do things differently. And the Old Testament is the Bible they used. Those morality standards, we've got to understand. Social scholars point this out very nicely. We have to understand in that day and time and place that premarital, extramarital, and other sexual behaviors, interfamily sexual activities, were part of the behavior in that society that would have been in direct, those mores would have been in direct violation of the Judeo ethic. And so this creates a problem of tolerance. He likely said, no, you need to use the scriptures, meaning the Old Testament, as your guide to what acceptable behavior is for people who are being brought into the church, and not to assume that because it is something is acceptable by the majority or a particular sub-community within your church, within your Corinthian outside community, that makes it tolerable. No, there is a new paradigm. Look at the Old Testament. Several scholars suggest that some members likely understood Paul to be saying in this earlier letter that's been lost, that you're not even to associate with such people outside the church. And they withdrew then from the community of the outside. That tended to happen at this period of time in history with a lot of different religious groups. But Paul is making it clear here that he is not judging the outside community. This judgment that he applies here is within the church. Clean up what's in the church. Quit focusing on what's outside. It is what you have taken into the church and allowed to continue is where the problem is at. Remove the yeast of sin from your congregation and keep your church as unleavened bread. That's kind of the message that I see as I pull from a range of scholarship. I hope you have a good lesson. Spend some time studying this and thinking about it. and hopefully we'll continue on next week with another lesson.